Yeah, thank you, David. As I think most of you here know, David kicked off an initiative a couple months ago to try to refine some of the work that Tom and company had done over the last earlier part of the year to kind of give us some more guidance on things like how to schedule releases and so forth. And so the intention of that work was to create documentation that we could put into the GitHub repository as kind of guideline documentation. As part of that, we developed some PowerPoint presentations to do this, to carry on the discussion. And today I wanted to show a shortened version of that, a summary presentation. It's about 8 or 9 slides long that just goes through some of the key points. And as I go through it, I'm going to point out a few areas where we have work to do and talk about what we see as the next steps. And so I guess without further ado, I'll get started. I talked about the background. There's just a handful of people, most of whom are on this call today, who participated in this. And we've also circulated this work to a larger group of people, including most of the people on this call. So what we covered was guidelines for scheduling major releases. From previous discussions, we decided we didn't want a fixed annual schedule, but we wanted to have some guidance on how and when we would schedule major releases. We also decided to kind of look at those guidelines and figure out what our next schedule would look like over the course of the rest of 2024 and early 2025. We took another look at change control guidelines to see if we're comfortable with that. And I think in that area, we're pretty comfortable with what was there, but we wanted to kind of give some more explanation of the principles underlying this and then how to evaluate whether the change control guidelines have been met. We did spend some time on pull request classification review and approval guidelines. That's an area, as we'll get into, that's work still in progress. We'll be trying to nail that down in the coming week or two. And then we had some more points about scheduling of minor releases and release and dev releases, and actually approving building the releases, sort of the nuts and bolts and mechanics. This is mostly just codifying what we already have, but we wanted to kind of get some clarity about that. So I'm going to go through each of those items in turn. I think most of the content is really in the first couple of bullets. Before I do that, are there any questions? Okay, if not, we wanted to create some guidelines around scheduling and approving major releases. And what that basically means is the work of the steering working group to decide what's in the overall plan for CDM. So the objectives of these guidelines is to communicate to the users of CDM when major changes will be made that might affect them, and to help us do our planning and give us some predictability about when things will be included. I think the aim of what we're trying to do is that we'll define major releases with a clearly defined scope, so that we know when big changes are happening, things that will break existing implementations. And then in between that, we'll have periods where changes can happen incrementally with predictable functionality. As I go through this is a summary of a more detailed version. So there's when we document this, there'll be a little bit more detail, but these are the key points. In terms of the rules that we saw, no major release should be planned or scheduled without formal approval of the steering working group. So the maintainers shouldn't go off and do a major release without the steering working group knowing about it. And the steering working group should plan and review those major releases. The guideline is at least 3 months ahead of time. So we know 3 months before a major release is happening that it's happening. You'll see it. Well, there are some possible exceptions to that, but that's the guideline. And we'd also anticipate for at least the next several years, we'd have at least one major release planned every year. Could be more often than that, but at least one. And a couple other things that when we change the scope or contents of a major release, the steering working group would be notified. So If we plan a major release and then somebody has a bright idea of adding something new, that would be something the steering working group would be reviewing. And similarly, going the other way, if we plan something in a major release and it's not available for some reason, the steering working group would be notified and would approve that. In other words, we wouldn't go ahead and pull the trigger on a major release if a major scope item was missing without the steering working group having approved that. And then finally, if we need to make an exception to that for some reason, some emergency comes up, it can be overridden by the steering working group, but it requires a formal vote. We explicitly say we need to make a decision. It doesn't happen by accident. So those are the guidelines we came up with. Are there any comments or questions on that? I think this codifies what we already kind of implicitly do, but we wanted to be a bit clear about it. Okay, then in terms of helping users to understand what's happening, we also thought it would be helpful if these guidelines, if the release schedule were created ahead of time and published out to the GitHub repository. So we're aiming to have at least 9 months to a year worth of plans published on the GitHub repository at any point in time, and to refresh that periodically. And in terms of what the implication of these major releases is, we would only allow breaking changes in major releases, major versions. So if something redesigns something that would break existing implementations, it would need to be deferred to a major release. And that implies that all pull requests that include breaking changes would only be approved for dev releases. And so would be included in the next major release. We also were quite concerned about making sure that if there is a breaking change, that there should be migration guides and transition plans to migrate the data in place. And so we wanted to make sure that there was a migration guide for the incremental changes. I think that's it. There is a point about, are there any situations where breaking changes would be allowed in a minor release or in before a production release? And the only situation we envisioned that happening would be if you put in a new piece of functionality in a production release, and it was so badly broken that it couldn't be used without fixing something. So that defect might imply a breaking change, and there'd be a process for reviewing that. Otherwise, the intention would be there'd be no breaking changes in production releases once the main major release was released. Okay, if there's no questions on that, I'll keep going. We've put together a draft of what we saw the 2024 and 2025 major release schedule is potentially looking like. And I'm going to go through that briefly. I think this is something that the steering working group will continue to examine in the coming meetings. But right now we have this idea of we're currently working on a version 5.x series. It's currently in production and active development. And there's a CDM version 6, which is in the development state. The expectation is that fairly soon, and probably in I'd say in early August, and I don't know if that schedule is updated, but that development release will be moved into production, and CDM 6 will become the production release. At that point, the 5.x release will be returned to maintenance. What that means is that no new functionality would be added, except in the case of some extremely business critical item that we in the steering working group agree has to be done, but otherwise the expectation is no new functionality would be included. And the expectation is that CDM 6.x series will be in production through the first quarter of next year. So we're saying sometime late first quarter next year, we anticipate moving to a CDM 7. That's just kind of putting a finger up in the air at this point. It's not a hard and fast commitment, but that's kind of an expectation. And we do have some ideas about what will be included in both the 6 and the 7 releases. So version 6 is pretty close to releasing. The asset refactor task force, there was some work on option exercise refactoring. There were some equity swaps refactoring. All of those things will be included in the CDM 6. There may be some other smaller items, and we'll have to refine that list. But those are the main breaking changes we see. In version 7, we anticipate there may be some work on refactoring dates. There may be some work on ingestion and mapping representations as new capabilities are put into the DSL. And there may or may not be any changes around serialization and reference data management and updating. So those are things we anticipate could be included in a version 7. And you've seen these bars here. Underneath it, there's a bar showing what DSL version there is. It's not very highlighted, but we anticipate the DSL versions will be continuing to upgrade. And as long as they remain compatibility with the previous versions, we'll be upgrading even older versions as long as they're still in maintenance. So that's what we have in terms of a schedule. There's some more detail beneath that we came up with in terms of the items in version 6 and version 7, but it gives you a broad flavor. There are some definitions we have around what the different stages mean. So development means new designs for the main branch that are still under development. It does mean that all the tests must pass, so it's not broken code. But the models may evolve before being released in production. So if you're working on a particular development version this week and then you upgrade to the version next week, your code might break because the backward compatibility may not have been maintained. Production means latest and greatest stable version. That's intended to be stable so that if functionality works in one version, it'll continue to work in new production versions. We would expect everybody to ideally migrate to that version. Maintenance releases means no new functionality is being added, except in critical cases. And beyond that, we have some sort of unsupported or end-of-life version. These are versions that will remain on the repositories. You can download them, but we won't support them. We may do some amount of security testing on some of those older releases to identify when there's security vulnerabilities, but we don't make any commitment to fix them if we find them. So you're on your own. And the intention is to have one centrally supported development version and one production version, and at most one maintenance version at any one time. So we'll roll those over as we move to a new production version. I've just gone through a fair bit. I think most of this is in line with what we've already done or already doing, but it clarifies it. Are there any comments or questions on anything I've said here? Okay, so that's those are the biggest items that we spent the most time on. We did spend a fair bit of time on change control guidelines, and nothing really, I guess, would have changed from before. But what we did was we focused on sort of a higher level view of what we're trying to accomplish with change control. So the idea of change control is to assist the rapid and smooth evolution of the model by determining and defining when breaking changes will be introduced, so it's easier for end users to keep in touch with that. And that the flip side of that is we want to prohibit major breaking changes within minor versions and to plan for how to migrate those. So there's some rules that we have come up with, and this is just a high-level summary. There's more details. Tom actually put quite a bit of work into this. This is good. The big thing is we want data structures or data types that work in one minor version to work in the next minor version. And we want test cases that pass in those minor versions to continue to work. And there's some specifics around that. For instance, don't remove data fields, don't change their name, don't change the cardinalities to make them more restrictive, and so on and so forth. Similarly, for the function signatures for VBA functions, or for functions written in Rosetta or Rune, the signature shouldn't change in a way that breaks existing code. And then finally, we spent some time thinking about how do we evaluate whether these rules are followed. And there's 3 tiers to that. First is that we expect developers who are making contributions to be aware of this and to assess for themselves whether they're making a breaking change. So we want them to, to decide, is this breaking an existing thing? And if so, should it go in a major version? Second is that the review process, so reviewers and working groups, and it says actually in the more detailed text, the contribution review working group are responsible for vetting that and verifying that the developers understood it correctly, and if they think it's a backward incompatible change, to flag that. And then finally, there should be some automated regression tests that enforce that. So test cases that work in 6.0 should continue to work in 6.1, for instance, and so on. And even between major versions, test cases that work in 5.x, we should try to run them in 6.x and see which ones fail and confirm that that corresponds to the approved breaking changes. So we don't introduce any unplanned breaking changes. So I think none of this is new in terms of the intent, but we have a little bit more detail around it. Any comments or questions on that? Okay, the next item we spent a bit of time on, not really done here, I don't think, but we've tried to look at pull request approval requirements. We looked at some of the work that Tom had done. We tried to see if we could simplify it. And then in looking at the simplifications, we kind of got a little nervous that maybe we oversimplified and we haven't really solved it. So we're going to have a discussion later this week to try to nail this down. I've reviewed this with Tom the other day and yesterday, I guess, and still not quite there yet with this. So we're gonna keep on working on this. So this is a snapshot of what we have right now, but it's likely to change. But the basic idea here was to try to keep it simple. Enhancements need a little more review and approval than defect corrections. And things that are backward incompatible have to follow certain guidelines. For instance, if you have a backward incompatible enhancement, it needs to be on the roadmap. If it's a backward incompatible bug fix, that would only be for things that are recently released and would require an approval and override process. What we did identify is that there's some other changes that are coming from outside, things like a dependency update for security vulnerability, mapping changes and things, maybe changes to examples and documentation that sort of don't fall so well into this. And that's where we're going to go back to talk to Tom and see if we can figure out how to get this. Maybe we can do a better job on that. And the final thing was just the approval of releases themselves, like the building and publication of releases once the pull requests have been approved. And so we came up with a list of the different types of releases. So development release is a release of a development version. Major release it's a relatively infrequent operation, once every year or so, or 8 months. Minor release is more frequent, every month or so. And patch releases would only be if there's defects. There could be several patch releases for a minor release. And we basically say we're going to put a lot of effort into scheduling of major releases. The minor patch and development releases, the scheduling is largely up to the maintainers. Although with minor releases, we're going to try to make them relatively infrequent in the sense of maybe monthly, every 4 weeks as a goal. Possibly a little faster than that if there's urgent business requirements, but not to have them every week or every few days if we can avoid it. And that's mostly to minimize the communication outbound to end users. So that's it for the work we've done. I don't have a slide for it, but the plan is to translate the more detailed version of this into documentation that'll be published in the GitHub repository. There's a governance.md file and there's a roadmap.md file, which we're going to make drafts on. Atari, David and I will reach out to you to work on how to publish those. We also have to kind of look at what's on the website, what's published out in the docs folder. So we got a little bit of housekeeping to do there. But that's the remaining work is to sort out this pull request approval process and then to translate this into the detailed documentation, review that, and then to publish that. That's all I have. David, do you have any comments or questions?